लाइफ में लेना देना तो चलता रहता है। इधर फ्लेक्सी लोन से बोरो कर लिया और उधर बाय मॉम डैड का वेकेशन डन। शादी का डिसीजन लिया, फ्लेक्सी लोन से और बोरो किया। प्रमोशन मिला तो ये लो थोड़ा लोन वापस कर दिया। थैंक यू। नए इंटीरियर्स का डील किया, फ्लेक्सी लोन से फिर थोड़ा ले लिया। ईयर एंड बोनस मिला तो इस बार लोन ज्यादा वापस कर दिया। लाइफ में लेना देना चलता रहेगा तो लोन्स में क्यों नहीं। इसीलिए फ्लेक्सी लोन फ्रॉम बजाज फिनसर्व एक ऐसा लोन जो जब चाहे बोरो करे, जैसे चाहे रीपे करे, वो भी चुटकी में। थिंक इट डन विद बजाज फिनसर्व।
हेलो, हर सीजन के लिए नए इंटीरियर्स?
हाँ, वो भी हर रूम के लिए।
फ्रिज, स्मार्टफोन या बड़ा टीवी?
तीनों क्यों नहीं?
अरे ये तो शॉपिंग लिस्ट में नहीं था।
सो अब शॉपिंग कार्ट में तो है। सॉरी।
अच्छा, नए आउटफिट्स की विश लिस्ट।
विश क्यों? Just add to cart and buy.
तो ये सब EMI पे?
और वो भी चुटकी में। On India's fastest growing EMI network. Think it done with Bajaj Finserv.
सर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। साहब, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। हुजूर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता।
अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान।
अपनों को खुशियां दिलाना आसान नहीं बनाते तो आगे कैसे बढ़ते। इसीलिए हम जो भी करते हैं उसे बेहतर बनाते आ रहे हैं, बनाते रहेंगे। बजाज फिनसर्व, थिंक इट डन।
माँ के बेडरूम का एसी या लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई, लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई, लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई। पुणे, पटना, चेन्नई, मथुरा या फिर बेगूसराय, या फिर बेगूसराय। नए घर के लिए चाहिए 4K टीवी हाई फाई, या फिर वाइफ को चाहिए लेटेस्ट स्टाइल। EMI है ना, EMI है ना, मॉड्यूलर किचन में पुराना फ्रिज क्यों है भाई?
शादी है नहीं, मैट्रेस पुराना है भाई। अक्खा इंडिया बोले भाई प्राइजेस है हाई। बेस्ट ही खरीदना है तो अपने EMI स्टोर पर आए।
EMI है ना,
अब काशी हो या वाशी, महंगा लगे तो EMI और बेस्ट ही चाहिए तो भी EMI, क्योंकि बजाज फिनसर्व का EMI है ना। विजिट www.emistore.com।
EMI है ना, EMI है ना,
धोखा है धोखा, धोखा ना खाओ जी। इंश्योरेंस फ्रॉड से बचना है बहुत जरूरी जी। वो एजेंट है या फ्रॉड पता लगाओ जी। एक्स्ट्रा ऑफर के झांसे में कहीं फंस ना जाओ जी।
अगर कोई अनजान कॉलर इंश्योरेंस पॉलिसी डिटेल्स मांगे तो कह देना उनको
मिलके स्कैम को एंड करो, हमेशा सेफ रहो जी।
Always verify the caller and do not surrender your insurance for attractive offers. हमेशा सावधान रहे, safe रहे. Issued in the interest of public awareness by Bajaj Finserv.
धोखा है धोखा, धोखा ना खाओ जी। जो होगा सो होगा ऐसे ना सोचो जी। पूछे OTP दो ना जी,
तो कह देना उनको
मिलके स्कैम को एंड करो, हमेशा सेफ रहो जी।
Being a hero is all about heart. It's not about ruling the world. It's about owning it. It's not about winning a race. It's about delivering a smile to the human race. It's about a spirit that just cannot be confined by geographies. It's about the heart that beats for the future and a soul that echoes the values of generations. And yet, being a hero is never about the hero. It's about the millions who celebrate them. Hero Motorcorp, the motorcycle leader. There's a gush of wind that hums a sweet song. There's a gush of wind that fights like a hero to fill the world with possibility. There's a gush of wind that jumps across oceans and mountains, embracing the entire planet. There's a gush of wind that blows away darkness. There's a gush of wind that blows for humanity. Because at Hero, we care.
In 1868, the Tata Group was founded on a philosophy that put the community at the heart of its existence. Today, we are $100 billion global enterprise. Our today has been built on enduring values. Our today is about delivering excellence across business sectors. Our today is about building a future-ready nation. Our today has a strong foundation with community at its core. Our today is dedicated to the communities we serve. day is always about more than just a day. Our today is a continuous journey for a better tomorrow. Tata. Leadership with trust.
Behold, the story of victory, of life over malady. Behold the saga of power, of science over sickness. Behold the tale of triumph, of dedication over disease. Behold the rise and rise of Cadila Pharmaceuticals Limited, one of India's largest privately held pharmaceutical companies based out of Ahmedabad, Gujarat, India. Cadila Pharmaceuticals was born out of the vision of a legend who left an indelible mark in the chronicles of Indian pharmaceuticals industry. He was Indravadan Ambalal Modi, the founder chairman of the company, rightfully christened as the Medicine Man of India. His vision to alleviate pain of the underprivileged through research-driven innovations has been driving Cadila Pharmaceuticals for more than 6 decades now. Innovations which are backed by the key strengths of the company, the state-of-the-art manufacturing and research facilities. The flagship manufacturing facility at Dholka, Gujarat, sprawls over 100 acres. This avant-garde facility is US FDA approved, besides meeting most of the stringent quality standards across the globe. It manufactures tablets, capsules, injectables, liquids, and orals. The second formulations manufacturing facility is located at Samba in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. The API facilities at Ankleshwar, Gujarat, manufacture a large number of key APIs and intermediates at this US FDA and ISO 9002 and ISO 14001 accredited plant. The company also has set up its first ever overseas formulation manufacturing facility at Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. This world-class facility is the only WHO CGMP compliant manufacturing facility in the region. More than 850 products spread across 12 specialties with many of India's top brands in its basket. Great goals are defined by far-sighted vision and achieved by seamless teamwork. A multicultural, multilingual and multinational workforce of over 7,000 employees is truly the propelling power of the company. Not just in the domestic market, the company has a wide global footprint with over 1,000 marketing authorizations across 85 countries. Its international sales force of over 150 highly diversified and versatile personnel lends it an outreach that blankets the globe. As the company grows, so does its commitment to research. Manned by more than 350 scientists, the R&D facilities of Cadila Pharmaceuticals at Dholka, Gujarat is an institution of breakthrough innovations. To take the focus on innovation to the next level, it partners with leading international companies to discover newer treatments. The Cadila Pharmaceuticals Group is gigantic. Its group companies complement and expand the dynamic vision of the company across new avenues of healthcare and newer fast-paced business areas. Cadila Pharmaceuticals is a gentle giant. Decades of dedicated research, groundbreaking healthcare innovations, and worldwide impact proves the infinite potential of one powerful emotion. Care. The success of Cadila Pharmaceuticals bears testimony to the fact that the care continues.
आने वाले कल की दस्तक हमें सुनाई देती है, नई मंजिल है जिस ओर हमें वो दिशा दिखाई देती है, नए नए इंडिया का नया जोश, नए जोश से निकल पड़े हम, आने वाला कल होगा हमारा, नए इंडिया का नया जोश।
और नए इंडिया के सफर में टेक्नोलॉजी की शक्ति लेकर आपका भागीदार रहेगा रिलायंस। नए इंडिया का नया जोश।
लाइफ में लेना देना तो चलता रहता है। इधर फ्लेक्सी लोन से बोरो कर लिया और उधर बाय मॉम डैड का वेकेशन डन। शादी का डिसीजन लिया, फ्लेक्सी लोन से और बोरो किया। प्रमोशन मिला तो ये लो थोड़ा लोन वापस कर दिया। थैंक यू। नए इंटीरियर्स का डील किया, फ्लेक्सी लोन से फिर थोड़ा ले लिया। ईयर एंड बोनस मिला तो इस बार लोन ज्यादा वापस कर दिया। लाइफ में लेना देना चलता रहेगा तो लोन्स में क्यों नहीं। इसीलिए फ्लेक्सी लोन फ्रॉम बजाज फिनसर्व एक ऐसा लोन जो जब चाहे बोरो करे, जैसे चाहे रीपे करे, वो भी चुटकी में। थिंक इट डन विद बजाज फिनसर्व।
हेलो, हर सीजन के लिए नए इंटीरियर्स?
हाँ, वो भी हर रूम के लिए।
फ्रिज, स्मार्टफोन या बड़ा टीवी?
तीनों क्यों नहीं?
अरे ये तो शॉपिंग लिस्ट में नहीं था।
सो अब शॉपिंग कार्ट में तो है। सॉरी।
अच्छा, नए आउटफिट्स की विश लिस्ट।
विश क्यों? Just add to cart and buy.
तो ये सब EMI पे?
और वो भी चुटकी में। On India's fastest growing EMI network. Think it done with Bajaj Finserv.
सर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। साहब, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। हुजूर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता।
अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान।
अपनों को खुशियां दिलाना आसान नहीं बनाते तो आगे कैसे बढ़ते। इसीलिए हम जो भी करते हैं उसे बेहतर बनाते आ रहे हैं, बनाते रहेंगे। बजाज फिनसर्व, थिंक इट डन।
माँ के बेडरूम का एसी या लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई, लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई, लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई। पुणे, पटना, चेन्नई, मथुरा या फिर बेगूसराय,
या फिर बेगूसराय।
नए घर के लिए चाहिए 4K टीवी हाई फाई, या फिर वाइफ को चाहिए लेटेस्ट स्टाइल। EMI है ना, EMI है ना, EMI। मॉड्यूलर किचन में पुराना फ्रिज क्यों है भाई?
शादी है नहीं, मैट्रेस पुराना है भाई। अक्खा इंडिया बोले भाई प्राइजेस है हाई, बेस्ट ही खरीदना है तो अपने EMI स्टोर पर आए।
EMI है ना, EMI।
अब काशी हो या वाशी, महंगा लगे तो EMI और बेस्ट ही चाहिए तो भी EMI, क्योंकि बजाज फिनसर्व का EMI है ना। विजिट www.emistore.com।
EMI है ना, EMI है ना, EMI।
नाची 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 नाची। धोखा है धोखा, धोखा ना खाओ जी। नाची 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 नाची। इंश्योरेंस फ्रॉड से बचना है बहुत जरूरी जी। नाची 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 नाची। वो एजेंट है या फ्रॉड पता लगाओ जी, एक्स्ट्रा ऑफर के झांसे में कहीं फंस ना जाओ जी।
अगर कोई अनजान कॉलर इंश्योरेंस पॉलिसी डिटेल्स मांगे तो कह देना उनको
नाची 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 नाची। मिलके स्कैम को एंड करो, हमेशा सेफ रहो जी।
Always verify the caller and do not surrender your insurance for attractive offers. हमेशा सावधान रहे, safe रहे. Issued in the interest of public awareness by Bajaj Finserv.
Private sector sort of rises at 6 in the morning. So.
All right, should we? So I think Jahangir, meet everyone else.
Hi, everyone.
We're Mr. Julio Salas. We have Mr. Christian Thompson. We have Mr. Pablo. Pablo, how do I pronounce your second name? It's a little bit...
Sanguinetti, but you know, you can do it. Sanguinetti, but you can do it the way you want.
You know the...
Sanguinetti.
Anyway, Sanguinetti.
Very Italian.
We have, of course, Jahangir, and then we have Mr. Juan Ketterer. Great. So, Anuradha, can we get started?
Yes, Sanjay. So, the message I get is we go live in 5 seconds. That was 2 seconds ago. So,
okay, right.
I guess we can start now.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, whichever part of the world you are in. Welcome to the 27th edition of the CII Partnership 2021. And I think to this special session of financing recovery, I think we all know what we're talking about, which is financing recovery from the kind of pandemic that we are still struggling to get out of. So I think we understand the topic. I think it's quite topical to talk about it currently because of the latest variant of the virus, differing challenges with different economies, different responses by policymakers in different countries. And I think kind of a need to have some degree of consistency going forward. And I would say some geopolitical cooperation that makes the recovery a little bit more uniform and probably more sustainable. This partnership summit has been quite an epic. It's had over 200 speakers, 7 country sessions, 20 overseas ministers, 7 Indian ministers. I would say 24 global CXOs and more than 100 heads of institutions and leaders and experts from around the world. It's spread for more than 100 countries, and this is spread over 3 days. So we are on the second day, pretty much the penultimate session. So thank you for being with us and thank you for being patient. I won't take too long. I want to maybe kick off by just making a very, very few remarks, which I think I just made a few. My view is that we would let the diverse set of speakers give a perspective from their respective institutions and countries, and that'll be extremely, extremely useful. I would encourage all of us to have some Q&A if we get some time, which I think we should. So like I said, the economy is recovering much more strongly than what we forecasted a year ago. If we were sitting in the same conference, it would have been a lot more cynical. But obviously, the extraordinary support from governments and central banks can't be underestimated, although now we may be wondering how they're going to normalize the situation. So that's the other side of the coin. All economies, developed and emerging, have faced different kind of challenges. But frankly, as they revert back to normal, they're reflecting back their structural strengths and weaknesses pre-COVID. So frankly, the policy approaches during pandemic may have helped you tide over the pandemic, but ultimately the recovery is still incomplete. And that is why the session, I think, becomes quite relevant to discuss how the recovery can be complete. And as I said to you in the introduction, Jahangir was not there. Some of us come from a simple banking background and a private capital background, and thinking simply as we look at our companies recover, what do they need to make sure that these recoveries are more sustainable? We go to the growth rate later, but at least more sustainable and much more kind of durable. We won't get into vaccination rates, different countries, different rates. So that's another unevenness that we have to tackle. There is obviously a marked variation in the outlook for inflation as well. This pandemic came back with a revenge in terms of the demand came back with a revenge. So pushed up the prices of commodities, and not to mention the disruption of supply chains, shipping costs, and various other measures. Different economies are facing different kinds of pressures on inflation. Well, even India is now, although I must say India had a lot more of a calibrated fiscal response compared to many others. And Prime Minister Modi's government has kind of calibrated the fiscal response, done it pretty prudently, and actually targeted it quite accurately towards public health, education, rural sector. And thanks to digitization, it's been a lot more effective to the place where it's meant to go. But we won't talk only about India in this session. It's meant to be a kind of a global session. So I suppose the silver lining is that global FDI has been huge in the first half of 21, estimated to be $852 billion. Shows growing investor confidence, although I might say more in the infrastructure space, boosted by favorable financing conditions, recovery stimulus packages, and obviously different responses from different central banks. Going forward, I think all the countries and institutions, all of you who are represented here, will have different kind of responses. Love to hear each one's views, and there will be a variety of views. So with those opening remarks, I just wanted to bring out the fact that the recovery is on its way. It is incomplete. One still doesn't know the impact of the new variant and what further disruptions one can have. Obviously, we're entering an era of a lot more inflation and disruption in supply chain. So we'd love to hear everybody's views as we go around. I'll just maybe make a half a second intro, but probably start with Mr. Julio Salas. Mr. Julio Salas is the Vice Minister of Economy and Small Business, Ministry, Economy, Development, and Tourism in Chile. So I think we just look at his portfolio. I think we're going to hear a lot about how Chile is responding to this crisis, how it's coming out of it. And obviously, Chile is a far more developed economy. So just to see how Chile has responded will be very interesting for all of us. So over to Julio, 5 to 7 minutes, and then we go around. Maybe that's a good way to do it. And I would say we should dedicate some time to questions after that. Julio, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sanjay. Well, I'm happy to speak here about the Chilean experience, about the recovery rates. Just to give some figures and some numbers, the overall government has spent about 14.1% of our GDP in direct measures for benefits for both households and SMEs. This is approximately $36 billion US, 2 billion of those went directly to the pockets of SMEs. And as a result of that, we have been experiencing a swift recovery. We're going to close this year growing at approximately 12%. This is the highest growth figure that we have since we have official statistics since the 1960s. So what's of course, the base of comparisons of 2021, it's different from 2020, but you need to take into consideration that the economy, at least in our perspective, when you reduce the curfews, when you remove the lockdowns, when you have a population that's willing to use face masks all over the pandemic for more than a year, still in the streets, everybody's wearing the face mask. And when you have more than 90% of the population vaccinated, well, at the end, you can start easing those sanitary measures. And that means that the economy, SMEs, are starting to grow again. And I think that there are different consequences of the pandemic, but we're coming out of the pandemic as a different economy in different fronts. And let me mention that just 3 aspects that I think are quite that's why I'm kind of optimistic in terms of the future. Because in the midst of the pandemic, in the worst crisis, we had some funds allocated directly to families. So every household in Chile, 80% of the households in Chile received some funding for that's based on the number of family members that they had in the household. That policy meant that every household had to have electronic banking for receiving those funds. So they were bankarized, and they also had credit cards or debit cards. In our case, to spend that money electronically. Most of the time, since you were not allowed to go easily, or you had to take a permit to go to the supermarket to buy groceries in the midst of the pandemic. So that means that you have 80% of the population with bank accounts, and that's something totally different from when we started the pandemic. Second, for something as simple as going to buy groceries in the midst of the pandemic, you had to secure a permit from government. And you did that, of course, online. And that means that we have more than 70 million transactions with government have been made by normal people using their cell phones. We have more smartphones than the population in Chile. But that means that we have a new way of interacting with government that we did not have before. So we have the families, they have bank accounts, they have credit cards or electronic payment methods. They are able to interact with government on an electronic basis. And also SMEs underwent, I believe, the most rapid transformation that we have seen, because in 2019, we as a Ministry of Economy offered roughly about 20,000 digitalization efforts towards SMEs. During the pandemic, we had to increase that to 230,000 instances of digitalization, and we're going to close this year with more than 400,000 instances of digitalization. So that means that no wonder that the OECD has selected the Chilean SMEs as the ones that the ones that advanced the most during the pandemic in the use of new technologies. Number one, and when you survey those SMEs, 90% mentioned that this is they're not going back. They're going to keep on using those digital channels. Alongside, as a government, we have implemented a lot of policy reforms in order to ease financing. For example, a new fintech law has been drafted in order to incorporate new technology. We have enacted our new artificial intelligence policy. We are discussing in government right now in Congress an update of our privacy laws in Chile. We are creating a cybersecurity agency. We're creating new institutions. For example, here at the Ministry of Economy, something as simple as the use of electronic signature for creating an enterprise in the middle of the pandemic. You can create that for less than $2 in less than 1 day. And that meant that during last year, there were more than 160,000 new enterprises being created in the country. 34% of those were attributed to the use of electronic signature. And that's something that I mentioned when we are entering the post-pandemic economy. There's a lot of informality in emerging countries, such as in Chile. But I think that if you ease up the administrative barriers for creating an enterprise, couple that with the subsidies that we gave to SMEs, there was a huge pressure from all the businesses to try to, okay, you might have started digital, but now you need to formalize and be a proper company. And I think that's going to be a major transformation looking forward, because informality, it's something that's really hard to tackle in developing countries. But I think that moving forward, if you have electronic payments, if you ease up the barriers for creating an enterprise, if you're able to communicate with government through electronic means, if you have households that have cash, then that means, I mean, you're easing down, you're toning down all the restrictions, the sanitary restrictions, thanks to the vaccine. That means that the economy is able to create new jobs and new employment opportunities. We lost approximately 2 million employments in the midst of the pandemic. We have recovered so far 1.5 million. We still have 500,000 to recover, especially in those sectors where female employment is predominant. Service sector, certainly the tourism sector, restaurants, and different types of services. And the only way that we're going to be able to recover those jobs is to ease more on the restrictions that we currently have in place. But so far, vaccines are working. We have our booster shots already being administered, and we're looking forward for next year that we can face the reality of COVID, because it's going to linger the disease on. But I guess that our economy and our population got used to living with COVID as a co-pilot, and now we're experiencing record growth thanks to all the measures that we undertook during the last year and a half.
Julio, thanks. That's fantastic. So I think, listening to your model, it's been obviously wrapping your arms around the SMEs, using fintech very effectively, interacting directly with the households, and sort of, really, again, like I mentioned, in our own different way, we're all trying to impact the end customer as much as we can with whatever subsidy and whatever benefit we're doing. So it's a fantastic model. Obviously, it's a huge SME economy. Maybe just a half a second on agriculture. You didn't mention that. I understand tourism you impacted, but maybe just a half a second on agri. I know it's not your portfolio, but I'm sure you know what's going on there.
Well, in terms of agriculture never stopped. So when we first defined the essential workers, we had all that discussion, who could open, who could not open. Agriculture was deemed essential from the beginning. So we didn't see any problems in terms of farmers growing, distributing, and reaching to the points of sales, either supermarkets or different grocery shops or fairs that people go usually to buy their groceries. So we have not seen any disruption due to the pandemic in that economic sector. We did observe huge disruptions in commerce, in services, and in certain specific industries, some industries that you never thought that existed. For example, one of the most severely hit industries was shoe repair. Of course, who would have thought? Everybody stayed at home, shoes did not worn down, or you were with your slippers all day. And yes, they lost more than 80–90% of their income within 1 year. So we did have to target those economic sectors with relief packages. Hairdressers, that's another sector that a lot of female employment, big one, female employment, they could not operate, and we had to work with them to have response packages tailored to the hairdressers and beauty in general sector.
Okay, great. Thanks for being so specific. Thank you, Julio. Maybe we move to Mr. Christian Thompson, the Vice President and member of the Management Committee of the EIB. We've all dealt with EIB at some point in our lives, if you are a banker. Mr. Christian Thompson started his term in 21 as a Vice President and member of the Management Committee of the EIB. And his areas of oversight obviously include the relationship with UK is one of them, but financing of the urban development, housing and social housing, financing of natural resources. So pretty big remit. So love to get your views on that. I think, you've also been Permanent Secretary of the State at the Danish Prime Minister's Office, and before that, the Permanent Secretary of the State for Finance. So a lot of background, and love to get your views how the EIB is thinking of helping the world at large, because obviously your remit is much more than just where you're based. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Nair. Thank you very much, and thank you to the Confederation of Indian Industry for the invitation to speak here today at this event. My focus will be on the EU and particularly the European Investment Bank's role outside EU, also in India, in financing the recovery, and also with a focus on climate and energy and digitalization. As you might know, there's a sort of growing focus in Europe on sort of the twin transition we're talking about, where sort of the way out of the recovery has to sort of be focused on climate and digitalization also. On the EIB, I can say that we are the bank of the European Union, and we also are more and more the EU's climate bank. Each year we provide around 70, or actually more than 70 billion euros of financing to projects. Almost 10 billion of these in countries outside the EU, including in India. And we support the policy objectives of the European Union, and we provide long-term project funding, but also guarantees for loans to small and medium-sized enterprises, equity finance, and also technical advice for preparation of bankable projects. Our position as a EU bank allows us also to blend EU grants with EIB financing, and thereby making our project financing more attractive, or even more attractive for our partners. On the international level, we are particularly proud to be partners in Prime Minister Modi's initiative, the International Solar Alliance, promoting solar energy, most notably in Africa. And we invested 40 million euros in the Serum Institute of India for development of affordable vaccines for Africa. The EIB has actively supported India's climate action. In particular, India's ambitious renewable energy targets for solar and wind generated energy, and India's strategic smart cities program. Ongoing investments in this area amount to 3.2 billion euros invested in urban rail projects in Pune, Bangalore, Lucknow, and Bhopal. The latest example is the 650 million euro loan to the development of Kanpur's metro system, which was signed last year. And this is actually our fifth investment in urban metro systems in India. The benefits includes less congestion, safe, affordable and reliable green public transport, and employment. We've also invested in private Indian equity funds targeting innovative small and medium-sized enterprises with a sustainability focus. And through guarantees, we unlock new sources of more affordable financing to small and medium-sized enterprises through cooperation with the State Bank of India and Exim Bank. At the summit in Porto this summer, the EU-India Connectivity Partnership was agreed upon. And at the recent climate summit in Glasgow, the COP26, leaders of EU and India reaffirmed commitment to expand our cooperation on climate change with the possible launch of a hydrogen alliance. And Prime Minister Modi announced India's plans to reach net zero emissions by 2070. And he also set ambitious plans to have India generating half of the country's energy from renewables by 2030. These are definitely areas where the EIB and India can work together. I think the prospect of India's transformation into a global powerhouse for renewables could present great opportunities for EU-India cooperation on climate, and it could generate thousands of jobs in the green industries. Another important area for increased cooperation is digitalization and innovation. They are equally important for the success of COVID recovery and climate action. The EIB has decided to set up a dedicated global branch to bring activities outside the EU to a new level and provide more support to partner countries like India. This support will predominantly include financing and technical assistance for climate action, renewable energy, and sustainable development. The European Union, with its member states, is the world's largest donor of development assistance and also among the first global trading partners and foreign investor in the world. And the EU's main financing tool to contribute to eradicating poverty and also in light of setting the recovery going and also to promote sustainable development for the period 2021 to 2027, that will be the NDICI Global Euro Program. It earmarks 80 billion euros for cooperation with countries outside the EU. And the EIB will of course be the EU's partner implementing NDICI in Asia, including in India. The European Union also wants to see more cooperation with countries like India in the areas of digital, energy, transport, and health. On this backdrop, the EU has unveiled its flagship, the Global Gateway Initiative, a plan for large investments in infrastructure development around the world. And its key principles are democracy, good governance, transparency, and not least equal partnership. It is a roadmap for responsible and sustainable investments that empower partner countries and aims to mobilize up to a total of 300 billion euros in investment for the full period. The Global Gateway priorities will include digitalization with a focus on digital networks and infrastructures such as submarine and terrestrial, fiber optic cables, also space-based secure communication systems, as well as cloud and data infrastructures, climate and energy, such as offshore wind farms in coastal regions, and other renewable energy, including hydrogen. Transport networks in all modes of transport, and health with a focus on the security of supply chains and local production of medicine and medical technologies. The Global Gateway initiative will also create a whole new spectrum of opportunities to EU-India relationships, and the EIB looks forward to support its implementation in the collaboration with EU and our Indian partners. Elementary school physics teaches us that energy cannot be created, but it can only be transformed from one form to the other. Energy to fuel innovation, digitalization, COVID-19 recovery, and climate action will have to be transformed from responsible, sustainable, and green financing. In the EIB, we believe that financial institutions will have to act as transformers of this energy and to ensure our economies have power to succeed in these processes. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention. Back to Mr. Nair. Thank you.
Thank you. Just quickly, this Global Gateway is already conceptualized, implemented, or it's something still being talked about as you look at the EU-India corridor, or is it? Just want to get a sense of that here.
Yeah. The initiative has been launched, but I also have to say that there are still quite a lot of preparatory work to be done on this and to make it more firm on what it is specifically, but the sort of the aim and also the strategy to place EU also more in a more solid position on a geostrategical position in this respect is decided, and the money to resources to use for this has also been decided. But still, I also have to admit there's still quite a lot of work to put it into a sort of implementation mode.
Got it. And maybe one more quick question. What do you see EIB's role, I mean, beyond India, in Asia as well in the coming years?
Our role will particularly be in climate-related financing. We will focus, as we have decided, to sort of become the EU climate bank, and we see particularly sort of good possibilities and opportunities in Asia, also in India, on climate, and we see this sort of a global thing that brings us together.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you. Let's move on to Mr. Pablo Singh Vinnetti. Pablo, welcome. You are the knowledge partner for this panel because your title is the Vice President of Knowledge Development Bank of Latin America. So before we start, what is the Knowledge Development Bank of Latin America, CAF? I mean, I've been around in New York and I've looked at Latin American countries, but I've not heard of the CAF. Maybe Jahangir has, but I haven't.
CAF is a regional development bank, like sort of IDB, but with the difference that we have mostly Latin American countries as member countries. We don't have developed countries in the board, just Spain and Portugal. So it's a very regional Latin American country, I would say. And of course, we do a lot of things on infrastructure, SMIC financing, and also now very importantly what Thomson was saying about climate change investment, etc. So we are kind of a development bank which would add, of course, lending, but of course also technical services and knowledge services.
Great. I'm not going to read out your CV, it's very long, but I just picked up your experience and research in areas of international trade and integration, economic development, and fiscal federalism. So I think that's interesting. I think we're looking for all of those inputs and more. So over to you for the next 5-6 minutes.
Thank you, Sajan. So let me say first to thank CII for the invitation to participate in this very important conference. I will do three things very shortly. First of all, I will briefly describe how Latin America is coming out of the crisis, how is the recuperation of the region. Second, I will outline some financial policies that the governments have been established to foster this recovery. And third, I will talk a little bit about what CAF is doing. So let me start going for the first point, how Latin America is coming out of the COVID crisis. I would say that Julio was already mentioned this for Chile. The economy is recovering faster than we anticipated. On average, the region will grow at 6.6, 6.7 in 2021, out of a fall with a similar fall we have last year. Of course, the recuperation is kind of heterogeneous across countries. Chile, I would say Chile, Peru, Argentina is growing at two-digit levels, and other countries like Uruguay, let's say Mexico, Colombia. No, Colombia is also growing faster. Are growing at, let's say, between 5 and 6%. So there are some heterogeneity there. But let me talk about two factors that are behind this fast recovery. First of all, of course, external factors. The first one is associated with the world economy that is also growing faster, and this has important implications, especially when you see US growing faster and also China for many of our products that we export, commodity prices that are still between 30% and 50% higher than the pre-pandemic times. So this is a very important factor. The second ones are, especially for small economies, in remittance. But these are very important. For Mexico, for example, that is not small, but it's near to US, it increases 40% last year and still are high during this year. And the third factor, of course, is that the financial global conditions are still very favorable with the interest rate at very low levels. We'll see whether normalization in the monetary policy in US will change this in the near future, but still are very, very nice financial conditions, so that many countries in the region can go to the international market to get new resources. But the second factor is more domestic and is associated with certain control of the pandemic. In the last 6 months, COVID infections in Latin America and deaths have declined very sharply. So this has allowed to reopening some very important sectors like services sector, like domestic tourism, restaurants, all these things that were closed. So this implies a very important increase in some indicators of mobility that already at higher levels than pre-pandemic. Of course, there are some kind of risk to this kind of positive outlook. The first one is related with what you mentioned, Sanjay, the global supply chain disruptions that have affected already industrial production, for example, in Mexico and Brazil. The second is that in December, COVID have increases, infections have started increasing in some countries. And of course, we are very worried about this new variants, Omicron, that is going around. The third factor is, of course, the possibility that the normalization in interest rate in the US could go faster than we expected, and this will, of course, reduce the financial favorable conditions that I said before. But let me go now to the response of the financial system to this crisis, which is very important. This is the theme of the panel, and this is very critical because to address these structural challenges that the region has regarding pre-pandemic challenge, regarding, for example, productivity. We need a very strong financial system so that credit to the SMICs and to financial infrastructure should be important. And for this, let me just say that, of course, the government and the central banks in the region implemented a series of policies during the crisis, like reducing the policy rates, they're reducing reserve bank requirements, short-term liquidity loans were also expanded, etc. But one important policy that remains, today is this guarantee loans programs that were coordinated between the fiscal and monetary authorities. In some countries, these guarantee loans were quite relevant. I mean, in Chile, Peru, Brazil, and Colombia, they were between 4 and 8% of GDP. these guarantee loans assure credit access to small and medium enterprise. This was very critical. I would say that as a result of these big whole measures in terms of a financial system, the financial institution in the region actually did a good job during the crisis. Total credit to the non-financial private sector actually increased, while at the same time, liquidity and the solvency of this financial institution remain on solid ground. And I would say I would try to mention some key players in this implementation of these financial policies for the recovery. One of those were the national development banks that had been, improved in terms of institutional setting and in terms of the instrument that they use. I would say that, for example, many of these guarantee programs were actually managed by these national central banks, like Banco de Estado in Chile, or COFIDE in Peru, or Bancoldex in Colombia. Also, national development banks developed some new instruments to reach SMEs, like, for example, they develop equity funds or venture capital to startups, to finance startups. This was the case of Corfo in Chile, or factoring programs, like the one established by the National Financiera in Mexico, special loan programs for financing exporters, like the Bancoldex in Colombia, etc. But of course, beyond reaching with credit to the SMEs, we need also financing of the infrastructure. This is key for productivity. And also in here, the national development banks have played an important role. For example, BNDES in Brazil has, financing directly many infrastructure projects, but also they have set up programs to let the private sector to participate in infrastructure projects, like through public-private partnership, PPPs. For example, also creating a special, project finance type of instruments. And let me finish saying that CAF have helped these national development banks through all of these kind of policies. We have an active program of special loans to National Development Bank. We have helped them through, for example, equity instrument to finance startups. We have helped them to these guarantee programs. And of course, CAF also have an important role, a historical role, in financing infrastructure in the region, especially infrastructure to connect more countries within the region, to regional integration. So CAF have financed almost over the last 20, 30 years, over more than 70 projects to connect countries within the region with infrastructure. This amounted to almost $30 billion, out of which CAF directly supplied $10 billion. But again, not only we finance infrastructure through sovereign loans to government, but also through promoting the inclusion of the private sector through this kind of PPP schemes, but also project finance. For example, we have created special finance vehicles in Colombia and Uruguay to finance infrastructure through the private sector. So the private sector not only support with this activity with new resources, but also managing this infrastructure would improve the management, the efficiency. Let me say to finish that through these instruments, we also help to develop the national capital markets using local currency. Because in some institutional investor and pension funds has also participated in these project finance initiatives. In summary, CAF support the recovery of countries through credit to SMEs, through these national development bank programs, but also providing financing to infrastructure. And two new areas in which we are now working, for the post-pandemic kind of period, is on things that already Thompson and also Julio were saying, which are very important for growth in the region. First, digitalization, not only of public sector, but the whole private sector economy. So we are helping the countries to improve the digitalization infrastructure. And second, the green economy that brings also very good opportunities to Latin America. Latin America has a very comparative advantage in terms of non-renewable energy sources. So we're also trying to help countries to develop those new resources.
Perfect.
Thank you.
So CAF is pan Latin America, or is it pan a few countries in the south?
It's 19. It's a country of 19 Latin American and Caribbean countries. We have 19 members, including Spain and Portugal.
Oh, I see. Almost Spain.
Most of Latin American countries already are members.
Great. All right. Thank you, Pablo. Hi, Jahangir. You are obviously familiar to the CII, to the Indian scene, and obviously on the global scene. Jahangir is JP Morgan's head of emerging market economics and commodities research, and Jahangir has been an emerging markets and a developed markets research king for a long time. So Jahangir, I sort of set the stage, and I think you're already hearing from the previous speakers. There seems to be some degree of commonality flowing across all the responses. There's digitization, there is uplifting the SME, there's the role of national development banks, and then there's a whole monetary policy overhang. Who knows what's going to happen at what rate? So I think
we'll know tomorrow, Sanjay. Good. Thanks very much, Sanjay. Thanks very much to CII for inviting me, and thanks to all the participants. This was very, very enlightening for me. Let me just focus on just the funding part of it. I'm going to pretend to be a macroeconomist right now and not veer into areas that I don't really know very much about. So if I just look at the macroeconomics in emerging markets, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, I know there's a lot of anxiety that people have that, global market conditions are going to tighten. I said, we'll know that tomorrow how much Fed is going to start raising rates and how soon. And things are going to turn out to be reasonably, difficult as we go into 22 for all of us. Something that we do not focus on in emerging markets. And the reason why we do not focus on that is because we don't have high frequency data, and this is savings in these economies. If this was US, we look at every month what is happening to the household savings rate, right? We don't do that in emerging markets. But let's go back to the point that you began this session with, that look, if we are going to have a recovery path that's sustainable, the governments have done what they have done. It has to be the private sector's role from now onwards. And the key to private sector funding is, do they have the savings? Do they have the funding to support that growth in investment and consumption? And on that front, I think that emerging markets behaved exactly like the developed market partners. So if you go and look at, even if you take China out of this equation, even if you look at EM ex China's excess savings, and I'm defining excess savings as savings less investment, was around 4% of GDP prior to the pandemic. So in 2019, that rose to about 10% of GDP in the pandemic, as it did everywhere else in the world. It's now down to about 7% of GDP, and most likely it will keep going down as the recoveries take place. So at the end of 2021, and as we look into 2022, excess savings being savings by investment of the private sector in emerging market is about 3 percentage points higher than it was in the pre-pandemic level. So there is significant amount of private savings in emerging markets to fund a reasonably strong recovery going through. I'm going to take, and since the minister is over here, I'm just going to throw an example of Chile, for example. Pre-pandemic, Chile's excess savings was minus 0.8%, so savings was less than investment. That rose to 8.5% in the pandemic year. That's come down to an estimated 5% this year, Minister, and we expect that to go down to about 2%. But you're still going to have more excess savings than you had in the pre-pandemic period. So there is still significant amount of savings still in the Chilean economy to drive growth in the coming years. The similar thing with Brazil and almost every country. The only country, Sanjay, that is an exception to all of this happens to be Turkey. Turkey is the only country where there is a very large amount of negative savings. So just to bring the focus back to India, and I'm sure that, once somebody had to speak about India, so I'm going to speak about India. Just to bring the focus back to India, let's do the same math, right? So the excess savings, private sector's excess savings minus investment in the pre-pandemic year in India was 7.2% of GDP. Now, who used that 7.2% of GDP? Well, the government took away 8.1% of GDP. So where did we get the rest of the money? We borrowed abroad about 0.9% of GDP. That was the current account deficit. In the pandemic year, that 7.2% of GDP of excess savings rose to 13%. Who used up that amount? 12.1% was used up by the government, because that's how much the government fiscal deficit was. It went from 8.1 to 12.1. So of the 13, 12 was used up by the government. And in the pandemic year, shockingly, India exported savings. Current account turned into a surplus of 1% of GDP. This year, the current year, we are just halfway through, but we're looking at estimates. Government fiscal deficit will come down from 12.1 to about 10.8. That's what we expect. This is government, central and state government taken together. Private sector savings is going to fall because the recovery is taking place. So people are consuming more, people are investing more. We are expecting 13% of GDP to go down to 9% of GDP. And this is going to result in about a current account deficit of foreign savings of 1.6% of GDP. So now comes the question, what happens next year? So at 9% of GDP, roughly, private sector in India has 2 percentage points of excess savings over and above what they had in 2019, the pre-pandemic year. So they can spend 2% of GDP in funding, consumption, investment to push private sector growth. But if the government does not play ball and does not bring down the 10.8% of GDP and keeps it, let's say, at 10.8 at 10, brings it down by 0.5% of GDP, let's say to 10.3, then that 2 percentage points reduction in excess savings will push India's foreign savings or foreign borrowing, current account deficit, above 3% of GDP. We all know what happens when India hits the 3% mark. People get jittery. And whether or not and this is going to happen in a year in which the Fed is going to tighten. And we are expecting the Fed tightening to start in June next year and go relentlessly at 25 basis points a quarter for lifting rates from 0 to 2.5%. So 250 basis points of relentless rate hike is what we have as a baseline. Again, we will know, tomorrow what exactly is the Fed looking at. So in a world in which global conditions are going to tighten, if India has to fund a private sector-led growth, and if the government does not play ball, then India has to go out and borrow it in probably a year they don't want to borrow. They shouldn't be borrowing. The point I'm trying to make, and this goes back to the issue that you raised, Sanjay, that the excess savings was there in the pandemic year. The excess savings was there in the private sector this year. It was in the pandemic year that the government should have raised fiscal deficit. It should have provided significantly more income support. It should, the SME sector, we talked about, both the SME sector across, Chile, Pablo talked about CAF, etc. The SME sector has had a massive income shock. And even though SME credit has picked up in the last 2-3 months in India because of the credit guarantee scheme, we have to wait and see what happens after the credit guarantee scheme gets exhausted, because it was running at -4% just before that. So the point I'm trying to make is that the critical issue is that the government needs to make space. And that is true, by the way, in Brazil. It is because the government's fiscal deficit is going to go up, or is proposed to go up significantly in 2022 in election year. That's where the anxiety is. Because of that, we expect Brazil to actually go into recession in 2022. So I think as with everything else in Sanjay, we've done this for a long time. It lies in the hands of the government.
But
It needs
Jagir,
to vacate this. Yeah.
but Jagir, on the private sector, why do you feel in India it's not in the hands of the private sector? Are they happy to take the risk and put money into capex now or not? Because the government has done its
No,
bit
it
in terms of public
already has.
spending.
It already has. Like investment as a share of GDP has risen about 2.5-3 percentage points since the pandemic year. It is doing it.
But isn't the government doing it? Isn't the government doing more infra and public health and education?
Half of it. But if you're going to sustain that, so the point is that do you want the government to continue providing growth impetus, or do you want the private sector to come into play? If you want the private sector to come into play, private sector needs to have funding. It has the funding, but if it actually uses up the funding, then it can't fund the government, and it has to go and borrow abroad. If it wants to borrow abroad, 22 is going to be a bad year to borrow abroad. It should have all of the government support should have taken place back in the pandemic year, back this year. The government didn't do that, and this is going to become a problem unless the government reduces its fiscal deficit significantly in 2022, which we'll know in February. Unlikely they will do that, and therefore we are back again into a situation where the private sector gets crowded out exactly when the private sector needs to move up. So I think that's the overall story. I think there is a granular story, which is who has the savings. And this is true for Chile, Brazil, true for all emerging markets, and including in India, that the people who have the savings are not the households and the SMEs, it's the corporate sector. The corporate sector made massive profits in the pandemic year as well as in this year. And therefore, there is a maldistribution. The distribution of the savings is very, very skewed in the hands of the corporate sector, members of CII. And that's a good thing. Don't take me wrong, because that means that they do not have to go to the banks. They can go to the capital market directly, whether it's the equity market or the corporate bond market. But unfortunately, as is the case everywhere else in the world, listed companies and big corporates do not create jobs. Jobs are created by SMEs. The SMEs will have to fall back on bank financing, especially, and the suspicion is that most of SME's balance sheet has been seriously damaged because of the pandemic. We don't see that simply because central banks have extended generosity by having forbearance. We all know that there's a shelf life to that forbearance. The forbearance will come off. Maybe not this year, sometime next year, the central banks will have to take off the regulatory forbearance. And that's when the world gets hit by a spike in NPLs. So I'm not very certain that the banks will either want to deploy capital or will have the space to fund large SME funding anywhere in the world. So we are bound down to the private sector being driven almost entirely by the listed companies who have more than adequate savings and they can really push through investment. But unfortunately, we need the SMEs to get the growth going. And I think critically, therefore, it goes down to the hands of the government. What exactly will they do in 22? But let me stop here, Sanjay.
Great. No, I think it's a great perspective. Yeah, the private sector, as you define SME, not when I was challenging your argument, I was referring to the large corporates. Why aren't they spending and doing more capex? But I think you're saying they are, and they're probably easy access to finance. It is the SMEs who don't have easy access to finance. And of course, we don't have a great bond market. And they're probably all the savings get preempted by the government. So you're right. I mean,
that's right.
Theoretically, this makes a lot of sense. Look, thanks. I think we'll come back and take a few questions. Over to Juan Ketra. Thank you for waiting. You were among the first to join like I was, but you're the chief of the Connectivity, Markets and Finance Division of the IADB. So I think, again, we have an interesting title. I'd love to understand what this is, but it seems that this is the kind of stuff that should be so relevant for this topic. As I was reading your background, this is what engineers the funding mechanisms and risk mitigation structures, guarantees, SPVs, hybrid funds to support public investments and PPPs. I mean, this is a pretty forward-looking division, and I think in a way it's what markets like ours, like Jahangir was saying, these kind of instruments, connectivity, mitigation structures, access to financing is just not available. And we are one of the unique markets where there is not a bond market except for the parastatals, and we know the reasons for that. So I'd love to hear your views on how the IIDB is helping some of the emerging markets to make finance more local savings available through these interesting structures. So love to hear your views. Thank you for waiting, but over to you.
Sure. My pleasure.
You'll have the last word. So you've been.
It's been very interesting sometimes to be the last one, besides being told that you are the last but not the least. Besides that, you have the opportunity to learn a lot, because what I'm going to tell you, I already know. So for me, the important thing is to hear the other people and to learn, watch and learn, or hear and learn in this case. And I did indeed learn quite a bit in this during this morning. You were talking about the intriguing name of my division at the IDB. We used to be, in the past, capital markets and finance. That was the name. So that describes you clearly what we do. But at some point, we decided to change the word capital by connectivity, because we think that markets looking forward are more of connectivity than anything else. And that is our sort of leitmotif in life and in the way in which we try to implement our activities in the Latin American region. Looking into the future, we see that there are like three major themes that are going to be going around in the next couple or 3 years. One is the recovery. Recovery, everybody agrees that has to be private sector led, but many people also agree that it has to be public sector accelerated. And I think that this is one of the most important contributions that we do at the IDB level, that is try to help our partners, our countries, our member countries in the region of Latin America and the Caribbean to set up policies to just do that, to make sure that the private sector has the ability to lead the recovery. The second big theme that we're going to be seeing around is this sort of inflation / unwinding of the central bank supporting policies, which is already be seen in mostly in the US, but we think that in the near future it'll extend to also the developing countries. And the third sort of theme that's a cross-cutting across these other two is the transition or the path to the net zero objective by 2050. This is something very serious because we think that this is one of the most important endeavors and challenges that human race is facing at this point in time. But of course, we cannot reach there unless we get out of the recovery path. So we have been working a lot during the pandemic years. We have implemented billions of dollars of programs supporting guarantee schemes, supporting national development banks, supporting SMEs. But beyond SMEs, we have tried to support value chains as a concept that goes beyond that. And now we have to go back to our main business, which is the most important thing in Latin America, which is the infrastructure gap. This is the major problem and the major need to remove this block towards the development of the region. And in a sense, you can see that the glass, you can see it half empty, or you can see it half full, in the sense that this new investment can be done on a heavy, sustainable basis. This the green bond market in the region, which is the market to be developed, which is being developed to support this major investment in infrastructure, is something which is catching up very strongly and developing very quickly, at least in our region and in the world as well. But since I am focused on Latin America, I am going to be talking about this. And that is one of the major endeavors that we're gonna be pushing during these coming years. And the way in which we do that is, again, mostly trying to create an enabling environment for the private sector to issue securities, bonds, whatever. They don't need to be bonds, but it's a figure of speech, to issue securities to support and to fund this huge amount of investment in sustainable infrastructure that needs to be done. And one of the most important components of this infrastructure, because we always think in infrastructure, roads, bridges, and so forth, it is the infrastructure of connectivity. The region, our region in Latin America and the Caribbean, is well behind in the connectivity infrastructure. We need to deploy broadband, we need to deploy 5G, we need to use wisely the spectrum which is available to the countries. And this is key because this is going to be a large part of the new economy, an economy which will be hopefully clean, that will be conducive to accelerating the path, the speed in which we're going to reach this objective of the net zero target, hopefully before the 2050 mark. So this is basically our overall view of the situation. But before closing my talk, I would like to stand also something to make sure that we have clarity in that during all this idea, during all this process, we have a strong mandate towards inclusiveness. All this has to be done on an inclusive basis. And inclusivity has to take into account mostly two things. One is the gender, and the other is the minorities. And we at the ADB, we are committed to undertake all these investments and all these programs based on sustainability and inclusiveness. So with that, I will close. I will thank you very much for organizing this very interesting event.
Thank you. I think great takeaway from your few minutes about both inclusivity and connectivity to progress the new economy. Very interesting. Thank you. So I think there's just lots and lots of ideas as I just look back on everybody's views on how different institutions that you guys represent and your countries and a macro view are tackling the recovery. I think everyone agrees it's not yet over with. It's not yet done. There's still lots of risks, not to mention the inflation risk and the monetary policy pullback. And every country and every region has got different weaknesses. So while the initial recovery may have been strong, there seem to be obviously a lot of things to be done to make sure it's sustainable. And I think what I at least picked up, and look, I'll open up to everyone else, is that digitization, SME focus, crowding in the private sector have been big themes across the board. And institutions like IDB, EIB, CAF, talking of obviously climate change, making it a green recovery and a more sustainable recovery is another big focus. The third is that infrastructure is a huge way the government can propel recovery and spending. But then, as we heard from Jahangir, you need to crowd in the private sector, which still is at the periphery as it pertains to investment spending, because obviously highly fiscally indebted countries are still crowding out the savings. But I'm happy to go around and just ask folks. I think all of us have heard everyone. Maybe a few minutes to just round off what all of you think. But my takeaway is that, again, Jahangir, you're a good person to sort of summarize this, but my takeaway is it's not done till it's done. And depending what happens at the rate of normalization being announced tomorrow, day after, whenever, countries like all of ours and emerging markets that depend a lot on foreign flows, what that means, and how do you harness local savings to come into the right sectors to create recovery and not depend on only foreign savings. So maybe, Jahangir, you want to just summarize a bit and we go around and just talk about it. If you get some audience questions, that'd be wonderful. We have 5-6 minutes.
No, I mean, I think I've hit the right point, Sanjay. I think, we all are dependent on the Fed. You really cannot avoid the Fed. But I think that countries like Chile, Brazil, Mexico, not so much, but Chile and Brazil and Colombia in that time zone, they've already started this process. In Brazil and Chile, both places, the rate hikes have already been significant. And I think that by the time the Fed actually starts hiking, which is probably going to be around June of next year, Chile, Brazil, Colombia, etc., will be in a position where they do not have to chase the Fed. So I think that's one saving grace. Now, all of that will come at a cost, and the cost will be that all of these countries in Latin America will face very high real interest rates in 2022, and that is going to be a dampener on growth. But at least I think the fear from the Fed raising rates and everybody having to be forced to aggressively raise rates is probably less in Latin America. I will also put in, for example, the Central European countries in that category. They will probably have fully normalized or almost fully normalized, Sanjay, by the time the Fed starts raising rates. I think the real concern is in Asia, which hasn't moved at all, and South Africa, which just has barely moved. So I think it'll be differentiated effect. But I really think that is the harnessing of domestic savings, which is key to all of this. And as I said, I mean, there is enough domestic savings. The question is, do the intermediaries, the banks, the capital markets, are they able to harness that savings and put it in the right places? The private sector, in the case of infrastructure, I mean, the government doesn't really have to be the one who spends the money. The private sector can spend the money provided you actually change the rules of the game and the financing options such that the private sector can do that financing also. So you can have, the private sector also being pulled into infrastructure spending also. So, all I'm saying is that I think different parts of emerging markets will have to deal with this differently, given their initial position. But the focus still needs to be on, there is this excess savings. How do they use that excess savings and allocate it in the right places?
Hey, Pablo.
Yes, no, I agree totally with Hanshir. The governments in Latin America now face very serious fiscal challenges. On one hand, the debt have increased between 10 to 12 percentage points, so that many countries, Chile, for example, is not the case. Paraguay is also not the case because Peru also have very low debt, but most of them have already level of debt around beyond 60% of GDP. So an increase in interest rates, as we expected in the near future, will pose a problem on how to stabilize these levels of foreign and indebtedness. So the question is, they already are in a plan to consolidate fiscal accounts, in the sense that to reduce, they are taking out this current expenditure, like a transfer, etc., to families and SMEs are now taken out in a sort of not very rapidly, but they are doing that. So they can use those funds to finance maybe some public infrastructure or maybe some participation in PPPs. That's important. That would, or they can also still use it as in the guarantee programs. These are very important because this will help to channelize these funds that the banks have or savings to small enterprises. So I think we need that kind of program to kind of spur credit to the private sector. So the question is how you reallocate funds from transfers of families and and firms to more productivity kind of productivity orientation, like credit to SMIC and some infrastructure. This is going to be key.
Maybe Juan, just a quick minute. In terms of the experience, as you said, it was called the Capital Markets and Finance Division. Have you, as your bank, done any work in just helping emerging markets develop a corporate bond and a parastatal bond market? Because have you done any work on that, and can you help some of these economies, especially like ours?
Yeah, this is one of the things that we do as on a daily basis. Let's put it this way. We have changed our way of thinking from when a project is not being financed by the public sector, by the private sector in the past. We would go to the public sector and hit them with a loan so they could fund the project, and that was it. Now the thing has changed. Now we go to the private sector and ask them, what would it take for you to finance this project? And you have to do that under competition, right? But if you do it properly, you come up with a solution, and then basically what you do is to set up or deploy a system of risk absorption instruments that fosters. So this is the same thing. The same principle applies to the bond markets. We are, deploying warehousing, where we've been doing guarantees, partial credit guarantees. We issue bonds which are partially subscribed by the ADB, so we can bring our preferred creditor status. Yes. There are many tricks.
So you can sort of catalyze. I mean, you can catalyze the development of this.
That's right. That's right. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
Moving away from funding into catalyzing. That's the thing.
Catalyzing, right.
Christian, anything on climate change? Well, you did put up your hand, but I was going to ask you something else. So maybe you want to comment first, and then I'll ask you a question.
I would like to mention that we, in the EIB, and we have particularly focused on issues of green bonds or sort of climate sustainability bonds and for some years now. And also the regulatory sort of framework in Europe has been developing, and we're looking into how could we actually bring some of this outside EU also in assisting countries or institutions outside EU in actually setting up sustainable bonds issuances and markets. We think it's extremely interesting, this area. Yeah, thank you.
Just the question I was going to ask you was, talking about the climate change stuff we spoke about, maybe there's a last point anyway, but just specifically on financing recovery, I'm still a little bit not clear about EIB's specific role and help on that. I understand the global gateway, the relationship and all that, but something specific to that, if you could maybe make a mention for our audience.
Yeah. I mentioned the global gateway. This is sort of a new thing, but our ongoing business is based on our own capital in the bank, and that is sort of primarily demand-driven what we are doing here. We expect about 1 billion euros of investment in India next year, and this will then also be complemented by some of these EU programs. The one EU program which has been made decisions on, and final decisions on, is this NDICI Global Europe program, which I mentioned before, the 80 billion. And that will also be relevant for India. But our basic business, and where we do most of our business together with India, that is sort of on the basis of our own capital, so to speak. And that will be particularly focused on climate and recovery in the years to come. I don't know. I hope that answered your question.
No, that does. So I don't know. Anybody else love to comment? I really don't have anything else. I don't think we have any comments from the audience. And rather, if we have, please tell me. Otherwise, happy to wind up. I think it's been a rich discussion. It just tells you there's lots going on in different markets. Things are not clear. I just really wonder sometimes why the markets are where they are, but they are where they are. And maybe Jahangir knows more about it. But I would say, look, it's been a pleasure talking to all of you. What a diverse set of views. And I think what at least came up for me was the role of the national development banks for those countries who are fortunate to have those, and well-funded ones, with great technocrats at the top. And I heard this thing about national capital market development, which has been a buzzword for us for very long. And I think it's just the preemption of savings that doesn't let us develop that. But it'll take a few years, and I think pandemic puts us behind a little bit because government has to finance its fiscal first. And frankly, India has been a fiscal hawk. If you ask me, in the context of the world at large, India has been the most calibrated. If I can make a small pitch for India, India has been very calibrated. The spending has been very targeted, and therefore our economic recovery has been very, very strong. But the question is, how widespread is it? How sustainable is it? And I think that's what we heard from all the countries and all the economies. So look, lots of question marks still. It's been a very thoughtful session. Thank you for the time. Thank you for being so attentive. I've tried to do the best I can. I'm not an expert moderator, but thank you, everyone. And I hope that folks find it useful. But it's been a pleasure. Thank you. Good night.
You did great.
Thanks, Sanjay. Thanks very much. Great moderating.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you, Juan.
Take
Thank you,
care.
Thompson.
Take care.
Thank you, Pablo.